They weren't just bank robbers. They weren't just outlaws. Bonnie and Clyde became a living legend. Two young lovers who carved their names into American history with smoke, gunfire, and a trail of cold-blooded headlines. But behind the glamorous Hollywood myth lies a much darker truth, one that's far more chilling than any movie ever dared to show. From brutal ambushes to kidnapping sprees, from desperate escapes to the eerie photos they left behind, this is the real Bonnie and Clyde story, stripped of the romance and drenched in the stark reality of the era. And trust me, once you hear what they truly did, you'll never see them the same way again. If you're ready to dive into one of the most haunting outlaw tales ever told, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe to American Old West Facts so you never miss another wild ride into history.
Fair
Bonnie
use
Elizabeth Parker
for
and Clyde Chestnut Champion
research.
Barrow were Depression-era American outlaws who moved across the central United States with their small gang in the early 1930s. Between 1932 and 1934, they carried out a series of crimes that included bank robberies, abductions, and other serious offenses. Although their names became closely linked with bank holdups and multiple deaths, in practice they more often targeted modest businesses such as small shops or isolated rural filling stations. Their activities, combined with the dramatic nature of crime reporting at the time, drew intense coverage from newspapers and magazines during the so-called public enemy period from about 1931 to 1934. On May 23, 1934, their flight from the law ended on Louisiana Highway 154 in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. A carefully organized group of law officers, led by retired Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, awaited their car and brought the chase to a permanent close. Historians generally agree that Bonnie and Clyde were likely responsible for the deaths of at least 9 law enforcement officers and 3 civilians during their criminal careers. Decades later, their story was reshaped in popular culture. The 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, directed by Arthur Penn and starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, took considerable liberties with the historical record. Despite its inaccuracies, it became a major critical and box office success, reigniting interest in the pair and presenting them with a strongly romantic, almost mythic image. By contrast, the 2019 Netflix film The Highwayman revisited the same period from the perspective of the officers pursuing them, focusing more on the investigative effort and the realities faced by law enforcement. Rather than glamorizing the criminal couple, Bonnie Parker. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born in 1910 in Rowena, Texas, and was the second of 3 children in her family. Her father, Charles Robert Parker, worked as a bricklayer but passed away when Bonnie was only 4 years old. After his death, her mother, Emma Krause Parker, was widowed and moved the children back to her parents' home in Cement City, an industrial area in West Dallas. There, Emma supported the family by working as a seamstress. From a young age, Bonnie showed a strong creative side. As an adult, she wrote several poems, including The Story of Suicide Sal and The Trail's End, the latter more widely recognized as the story of Bonnie and Clyde. She was known as a bright child who enjoyed being in the spotlight, loved performing on stage, and dreamed of one day becoming an actress. During her second year of high school, Bonnie met Roy Thornton. The two left school and were married on September 25th, 1926, just 6 days before her 16th birthday. The relationship, however, was troubled. Thornton was often away and frequently involved in legal problems, and the marriage quickly broke down. Although they separated and never lived together again after January 1929, they never formally divorced. When Bonnie died in 1934, she was still wearing the wedding ring Roy had given her. Thornton, who was in prison when he learned of her death, reportedly remarked, "I'm glad they jumped out like they did. It's much better than being caught." Thornton himself received a 5-year sentence for robbery in 1933. After several attempts to escape from different institutions, he lost his life during an escape attempt from Huntsville State Prison on October 3, 1937. Following her separation from Thornton, Bonnie returned to live with her mother and took a job as a waitress in Dallas. One of her regular customers at the cafe was a postal worker named Ted Hinton. In 1932, Hinton joined the Dallas County Sheriff's Department and later became part of the law enforcement group that ultimately brought an end to Bonnie and Clyde's time on the run. In early 1929, at the age of 18, Bonnie kept a brief diary. In it, she wrote about feeling lonely, her frustration with the routine of life in Dallas, and her fondness for photography, offering a rare glimpse into her inner thoughts before she became nationally known. Clyde Barrow. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born in 1909 into a poor farming family near the small community of Tellico in Ellis County, Texas. He was the fifth of 7 children born to Henry Basil Barrow and Kumi Talitha Walker. In the early 1920s, like many rural families seeking opportunity, the Barrows moved to Dallas. They settled in West Dallas, an area known for difficult living conditions. During their first months there, they had so little money that they lived under their wagon until they could afford a tent. Barrow's first documented encounter with the law came in late 1926, when he was 17. He ran from officers who questioned him about a rental car he had kept past the agreement. Not long after, he was arrested again with his brother Buck Barrow in connection with stolen turkeys. Between 1927 and 1929, Clyde held several legitimate jobs, but he also became involved in theft and other illegal activities, including breaking into safes, robbing small businesses, and stealing cars. In January 1930, he met 19-year-old Bonnie Parker through a mutual friend. The two quickly formed a close bond and spent much of their time together over the following weeks. Their developing relationship was cut short when Clyde was arrested by Dallas County Sheriff's Deputy Burt Wisnan and later convicted of auto theft. While being held at the McLennan County Jail in Waco, Texas, Barrow escaped on March 11, 1930, using a firearm that Bonnie had secretly brought to him. He was recaptured a week later on March 18th, and in April 1930, he was transferred to Huntsville State Prison. By September of that year, he had been assigned to the Eastham Prison Farm at age 21. During his time in prison, Barrow endured serious mistreatment, including sexual abuse. In response to this, he became involved in a confrontation with another inmate, who later died as a result of the encounter. Another prisoner who was already serving a life sentence claimed responsibility for the incident, shielding Clyde from additional formal charges. Desperate to avoid the harsh physical labor of the prison farm, Barrow went so far as to have 2 of his toes removed in late January 1932. Accounts differ as to whether he did this himself or had another inmate perform the procedure. From then on, he walked with a limp, which affected his mobility for the rest of his life. Ironically, he did not know that his mother had already petitioned for his early release, and he was freed just 6 days after this act. Clyde was officially paroled from Eastham on February 2, 1932. Family and fellow inmates later remarked that the experience had changed him deeply. His sister Marie said that something terrible must have happened to him in prison because he was not the same person when he returned home. Fellow inmate Ralph Foltz observed that he watched Clyde change from a schoolboy to a rattlesnake, a metaphor for how hardened and embittered he had become. After leaving Eastham, Barrow focused much more heavily on crime. Historical research suggests that he and his associates held up far more small groceries and gas stations than the relatively few bank robberies commonly associated with the Barrow gang. His preferred firearm was the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, a powerful weapon for the time. According to historian John Neal Phillips, Clyde's primary goal was not to become rich or famous through crime. Instead, much of his motivation appears to have been driven by a desire to strike back at the Texas prison system, which he believed had treated him with extreme injustice during his incarceration. First meeting. There are multiple versions describing how Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow first met. One of the better supported accounts places their introduction on January 5, 1930, at the home of Barrow's friend Clarence Clay, located at 105 Herbert Street in West Dallas. At the time, Clyde was 20 and Bonnie was 19. Bonnie was staying with a friend and helping her recover from a broken arm. Clyde happened to stop by the house while Bonnie was in the kitchen preparing hot chocolate. Their connection began almost immediately, and they spent considerable time together before Clyde was later in prison. When Clyde was released from prison in February 1932, he teamed up with Ralph Foltz. The two committed a series of robberies, mainly involving small stores and gas stations. Their long-term plan was to gather enough funds and equipment to carry out an attack on Easton Prison, which Clyde deeply resented after his time there. On April 19, 1932, Bonnie and Ralph Foltz were arrested during an unsuccessful attempt to break into a hardware store in Kaufman, Texas, where their goal had been to obtain firearms. Bonnie was held for several months, but ultimately released after the grand jury declined to indict her. Foltz, however, was convicted and served a prison sentence, and he did not reconnect with the Barrow Group afterward. While in the Kaufman County Jail, Bonnie wrote poetry to occupy her time. Within a few weeks of being released, she reunited with Clyde and rejoined him in his travels. On April 30th, 1932, Clyde served as a getaway driver during a robbery in Hillsborough. During the event, store owner J.N. Bucher lost his life. Although Clyde remained in the car, Bucher's wife later identified him from police photographs as one of the participants. On August 5, 1932, Clyde, Raymond Hamilton, and Ross Dyer were drinking moonshine at a country dance in Stringtown, Oklahoma. When Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and Deputy Eugene C. Moore approached them in the parking area, Clyde and Hamilton fired their weapons. Deputy Moore died from his injuries, and Sheriff Maxwell was seriously wounded. This incident marked the first time a law officer lost his life as a result of contact with the Barrow Group. In total, 9 officers would eventually die in incidents connected to the gang. Another case linked to the group occurred on October 11, 1932, when they were accused of causing the death of Howard Hall during a robbery in Sherman, Texas. However, some historians question whether Clyde and Bonnie were truly involved in this event. A longtime family friend, W. Dudley Jones, joined Bonnie and Clyde on Christmas Eve 1932 when he was just 16 years old. All three left Dallas that night. The following day in Temple, Texas, Jones and Clyde were involved in the death of Doyle Johnson while attempting to take his car. On January 6, 1933, Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis died during an unexpected encounter with Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones. The trio had unknowingly walked into a law enforcement trap intended for another suspect. By this point, April 1932 through early January 1933, the Barrow Group had been connected to 5 deaths, reflecting how quickly their activities escalated during this period. Buck and Blanche Barrow joined the gang. On March 22, 1933, Clyde's brother Buck Barrow received a full pardon and was released from prison. He and his wife Blanche soon joined Bonnie, Clyde, and W.D. Jones at a temporary hideout located at 3,347.5 Oak Ridge Drive in Joplin, Missouri. According to family accounts, Buck and Blanche did not intend to become part of the gang. They were mainly there to visit and also hoped to convince Clyde to turn himself in and end his life on the run. During their stay, the group drew unwanted attention in the quiet neighborhood. They spent long nights playing loud card games, often accompanied by large amounts of alcohol. Blanche later said they bought a full case of beer every day. The men came and went at odd hours, and Clyde accidentally discharged a Browning automatic rifle inside the apartment while cleaning it. Although no local residents approached the house directly, at least one neighbor reported suspicious activity to the Joplin Police Department. On April 13, 1933, believing the residents to be bootleggers, local police sent a 5-man team and 2 vehicles to investigate. When officers arrived, the situation quickly escalated. The Barrow brothers and Jones responded with gunfire, resulting in the deaths of Detective Harry L. McGinnis and Constable J.W. Harriman. Bonnie Parker also fired a Browning automatic rifle to provide cover as the others fled. Highway Patrol Sergeant G.B. Kaler took shelter behind a large oak tree, where
William Shakespeare.
The real Bonnie and Clyde Mobster
took shelter behind a large oak tree, where fragments of wood were driven into his face by the force of the bullet striking the trunk. The group managed to escape together. As they drove off, they pulled Blanche into the car from the street, where she had been running after her dog, Snowball. Later testimony from the surviving officers indicated that they fired only 14 shots during the exchange. 1 round hit Jones in the side, another struck Clyde but was deflected by a coat button, and one grazed buck after bouncing off a wall. Although the group escaped Joplin, they left behind a significant amount of evidence. Police recovered almost all of their belongings, including Buck's recently issued parole papers, a large collection of weapons, a handwritten poem by Bonnie, and a camera containing several undeveloped rolls of film. When the Joplin Globe developed the film, the photographs revealed staged poses of Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones holding guns and acting out mock scenes. These images, along with Bonnie's poem, were sent over national news wires. One photograph, Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth and a pistol in her hand, became especially famous. As a result, the Barrow Gang suddenly found themselves transformed into front-page news across the United States. The photograph of Bonnie Parker posing with a cigar and a handgun quickly captured the public's imagination. In his book, Go Down Together, The True Untold Story of Bonnie and Clyde, author Jeff Gwynne points out that while John Dillinger had movie star looks and Pretty Boy Floyd had a memorable nickname, the Joplin photos introduced a new kind of criminal celebrity. Bonnie and Clyde were young, rebellious, and portrayed as a romantic couple, which added a provocative edge that fascinated audiences. Over the next 3 months, the group traveled widely, ranging from Texas all the way north to Minnesota. In May, they attempted to rob a bank in Lucerne, Indiana, and successfully robbed a bank in Okabena, Minnesota. During this period, they also carried out several kidnappings. In Ruston, Louisiana, they took Dillard Darby and Sophia Stone while taking Darby's car. This was one of several episodes between 1932 and 1934 involving abducted police officers or robbery victims. However, the Barrow Gang often released the people they took, usually far from their homes, and sometimes even giving them money to help them get back. These unusual, sometimes almost courteous gestures made headlines, just as their more dangerous activities did. Despite these occasional acts of unexpected consideration, the gang was still heavily armed and quick to use force. They were prepared to confront anyone who stood in their way, whether it was law enforcement or bystanders. Other members besides Bonnie and Clyde, such as Raymond Hamilton, W.D. Jones, Buck Barrow, and Henry Methvin, were also involved in incidents that led to deaths. Over time, the repeated loss of life associated with their crimes changed public opinion. The early fascination fueled by sensational photographs and dramatic stories gradually gave way to a clearer awareness of the serious harm they caused. And this shift in perception played a role in how determined authorities became to stop them. Blanche Barrow later wrote about this period from prison in the late 1930s. She described a group that, despite its brief brush with glamorous notoriety, was actually exhausted, anxious, and increasingly unhappy. With their faces now widely recognized, day-to-day living became much harder. Restaurants, hotels, and motor courts were no longer safe places to stay. To avoid detection, the gang often camped outdoors, cooked over fires, and bathed in cold streams. Being crowded together in one car almost all the time also created constant tension and frequent arguments. W.D. Jones, who had been close to the Barrow family since childhood, was driving when he and Clyde took a car belonging to Darby in late April. Jones later used that same car to leave the group for a time and stayed away until June 8th. On June 10th, while Clyde was driving with Bonnie and Jones near Wellington, Texas, he missed warning signs at a bridge that was under construction. Their car went off the road into a ravine. Accounts differ on whether the burns Bonnie suffered came from gasoline or from battery acid, but historians agree that she received severe third-degree burns to her right leg. The injury was so serious that the leg contracted, and her mobility was greatly reduced. Jones later recalled that her condition looked extremely grave, and that none of them expected her to survive at first. For a time, she could barely move on her own, and either hopped on her good leg or had to be carried by Clyde. After the accident, they received help from a nearby farm family. Shortly afterward, in an effort to avoid arrest, they took Collinsworth County Sheriff George Corey and City Marshal Paul Hardy with them for a time, later leaving them handcuffed to a tree near Eric, Oklahoma, where they were soon found unharmed. Bonnie, Clyde, and Jones then met up again with Buck and Blanche and hid in a tourist court near Fort Smith, Arkansas, while Bonnie's burns were treated as best as circumstances allowed. During this same period, Buck Barrow and W.D. Jones carried out a robbery in Alma, Arkansas that resulted in the death of Town Marshal Henry D. Humphrey. Because of the increased attention from law enforcement, and despite Bonnie's serious condition, the group was forced to move on quickly once again. Final run. On January 16, 1934, Clyde Barrow helped organize the escape of Raymond Hamilton, Henry Methvin, and several other prisoners in what became known as the Eastham Breakout. The bold nature of this raid reflected badly on Texas authorities, and according to historian John Neal Phillips, seemed to fulfill what may have been Barrow's main objective: striking back at the Texas Department of Corrections. During the escape, Barrow gang member Joe Palmer fired on Major Joe Croson, who was seriously injured and passed away a few days later in the hospital. This incident prompted both Texas officials and federal authorities to commit their full resources to tracking down Barrow and Bonnie Parker. As Croson fought for his life, Prison Chief Lee Simmons reportedly vowed that everyone involved in the breakout would eventually be located and dealt with. In time, all of them lost their lives in connection with law enforcement efforts, with the sole exception of Henry Methvin. Methvin avoided that fate by cooperating with authorities and assisting in arranging the ambush that ended Barrow and Parker's flight. In response to the Eastham breakout, the Texas Department of Corrections reached out to former Texas Ranger Captain Frank Hamer and persuaded him to pursue the Barrow gang. Although he was formally retired, his commission was still active. He agreed to take on the role of a Texas Highway Patrol officer assigned as a special investigator for the prison system, with a clear directive to bring an end to the gang's activities. Frank Hamer was known as a tall, powerfully built, and reserved man who was not easily impressed by rank or titles. He was guided by a strict personal sense of right and wrong, and for 2 decades had been both respected and feared across Texas as a living example of the one riot, one ranger tradition. Over the course of his career, Hamer took part in a number of high-profile arrests and armed confrontations with criminals. Official records credit him with being involved in incidents in which 53 people died, and he himself sustained 17 separate injuries in the line of duty. Ambush and deaths. By May 1934, Clyde Barrow had 16 active warrants against him across 4 different states. These warrants covered a range of charges, including robbery, auto theft, escape, assault, and several deaths connected to his actions. Frank Hamer, who had begun tracking Bonnie and Clyde on February 12th, led the law enforcement team assigned to locate them. He carefully studied the gang's travel patterns and discovered that they moved in a large circular route through 5 Midwestern states. They often relied on crossing state lines because law officers in that era generally could not pursue suspects outside their own jurisdictions. Barrow was predictable in his routines, allowing Hamer to map out likely future stops. The gang frequently visited family members, and Hamer believed they would soon reconnect with Henry Methvin's relatives in Louisiana. What Hamer did not know was that Clyde himself had chosen the Methvin home as an emergency meeting point if the gang members became separated. At this time, Methvin had in fact become separated from Clyde and Bonnie while in Shreveport. Hamer's posse consisted of 6 officers. From Texas, Frank Hamer, Ted Hinton, Bob Alcorn, and B.M. Manny Galt. From Louisiana, Sheriff Henderson Jordan and Deputy Prentice Morrell Oakley. On May 21st, the 4 Texas officers were in Shreveport when they learned that Bonnie and Clyde were expected to visit the home of Ivy Methvin in Bienville Parish that evening. The entire team then moved into position. The posse set up an ambush along Louisiana State Highway 154, just south of Gibbsland and near the small community of Sales. According to Hinton, the officers were in place by 9 p.m. and waited through the entire next day, May 22nd, without seeing the couple. Other accounts suggest the officers may not have fully settled in until the evening of May 22nd. At about 9:15 a.m. on May 23rd, the posse, still hidden in roadside brush and nearly ready to abandon the stakeout, heard a car approaching at high speed. In their official report, the officers stated that Methvin had agreed to park his truck along the roadside that morning. They hoped that Clyde would stop to speak with him, bringing the Ford close enough for the concealed posse to act. Moments later, the approaching vehicle proved to be the Ford V8 driven by Clyde Barrow. As expected, he slowed the car when he saw the truck. The 6 officers then opened fire while the car was still moving. Deputy Oakley fired the first shot. Barrow was struck immediately and died instantly, and Ted Hinton later reported hearing Bonnie Parker cry out. A total of approximately 130 rounds were discharged into the car. Over the years, Bonnie and Clyde had survived several previous gunshot wounds from earlier confrontations, but on this day the injuries both received would have been fatal, regardless of the medical care available at the time. Funeral and burial. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had expressed a wish to be buried next to each other, but Bonnie's family did not approve of the idea and chose not to allow it. Her mother had hoped to bring Bonnie's body home, but the enormous crowd surrounding the Parker residence made this impossible. More than 20,000 people attended Bonnie Parker's funeral, creating such large crowds that even her family struggled to reach the gravesite. Her service took place on May 26. According to funeral director Alan Campbell, floral arrangements arrived from all over the country. Some even carried cards claiming to be from well-known outlaws such as Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger. One of the most impressive floral displays was sent by a group of Dallas newsboys, as the dramatic end of Bonnie and Clyde had helped sell an estimated 500,000 newspapers in Dallas alone. Bonnie Parker was first buried in Fishtrap Cemetery, but her remains were moved in 1945 to Crown Hill Cemetery in Dallas, where she rests today. Large crowds also gathered outside both funeral homes in Dallas, hoping for a glimpse of the two outlaws. Clyde Barrow's funeral was private and took place at sunset on May 25th. He was laid to rest in Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas, beside his brother Marvin, Buck. The two Barrow brothers share a single granite headstone engraved with their names and an epitaph chosen by Clyde himself. Gone but not forgotten. In the end, Bonnie and Clyde weren't the glamorous rebels the newspapers made them out to be. They were two restless young souls tangled in a storm of choices that spiraled far beyond anything they imagined. Their story still chills us today, not because of the headlines they created, but because of how quickly fame, fear, love, and desperation fused into a legend America can't forget. If their real story surprised you, or even
Story of the real Bonnie and Clyde on Mobster Files. Hit the Cash App, $ Black Ophinum #1.
What led to the final shootout of Bonnie and Clyde? The notorious American outlaws labeled as public enemy #1 by the FBI. Involved in a series of bank robberies and murders, the shootout that ended their criminal careers took place on a rural road in Louisiana. The authorities had been pursuing them for quite some time and set up an ambush to end them once and for all. When they approached the site in their stolen Ford V8, law enforcement officers unleashed a barrage of bullets, firing more than 130 rounds, shredding the car in the process. The couple was killed almost instantly in the hail of gunfire, ending their infamous crime spree.
Frank Hamer was a Texas Ranger who led the 1934 posse that apprehended and killed criminals Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. He became known as the archetypal Texas Ranger in the Southwest due to his toughness, marksmanship, and investigative abilities. As senior captain of the Texas Rangers, Hamer led the fight against the Ku Klux Klan in Texas beginning in 1922, and he is believed to have saved at least 15 people from lynch mobs. He is a member of the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame. His professional record and reputation are contentious, particularly in light of his willingness to use extrajudicial killing even in a modernizing society. Welcome back, but before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Past Crimes channel and leave us a comment below. In 1884, where his father ran a blacksmith shop. He was one of 5 sons raised in a devoutly Presbyterian family, and 4 of whom became Texas Rangers. He grew up on the Welch Ranch in San Saba County, and later spent time in Oxford, Llano County. He later joked about being the only Oxford-educated Ranger, although his formal education ended after the 6th grade. He exhibited several unusual abilities as a child, including extremely high intelligence and a near-eidetic memory, or rather a photographic memory. While working on the Carr Ranch in West Texas in 1905, Hamer made his law enforcement debut when he apprehended a horse thief. The following year, Hamer joined the Rangers as recommended by the local sheriff after being so impressed. He knew the patterns and signs of nature and felt at home on the wide Texas prairie. He interpreted men in terms of animal characteristics. The criminal is a coyote, always taking a look over his shoulder. Over the course of his adult life, Hamer served as a ranger intermittently, frequently resigning to accept other positions. On April 21, 1906, he enlisted in Company C under Captain John H. Rogers in Alpine, Texas, and started guarding the Mexican border. He left the Rangers in 1908 to become the city marshal of Navasota, Texas, which was a lawless boomtown plagued by violence. Shootouts on the main street were so frequent that in 2 years at least 100 men died. At the age of 24, Hamer settled in and started enforcing law. He relocated to Houston in 1911 to work as a special investigator for Mayor Horace Baldwin Rice, where he was seconded to the Harris County Sheriff's Office. He was appointed the department's investigator for livestock theft upon being hired as a deputy sheriff in Kimball County in 1914. In 1915, Hamer rejoined the Rangers, and during the Bandit War and La Matanza, he was tasked with guarding the South Texas border near Brownsville. As a result of the ongoing unrest in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, the Rangers dealt with armed smugglers. During the Prohibition era, they also made an effort to control the bandits who frequented the border as well as the bootleggers. He left the Rangers and joined the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association as a special ranger. Gladys Sims, the widow of Ed Sims, whom she and her brother Sidney Arthur Johnson had been accused of killing in 1916, was married to Hamer in 1917. On October 1st, 1917, Ed Sims' brother-in-law Gus McMeans unexpectedly appeared while Hamer and Gladys and other family members were stopped at a garage in Sweetwater to get gas. The Hamers and McMeans engaged in a gunfight. McMeans was a former Texas Ranger and served as the sheriff of Ector County. He and Hamer were clinched, and McMeans died after taking a bullet to the heart while Hamer sustained injuries. The gunfight resulted in 10 shots being fired, and police were able to seize 3 rifles, 2 semi-automatic pistols, and 7 revolvers from the 2 sides. Soon after, Hamer resigned from the Cattlemen's Association to work as a federal agent in the Prohibition Unit for about a year. His time in El Paso, which saw many gunfights during the Prohibition era, was stationed during his brief but eventful service. His time in El Paso, which saw many gunfights during the Prohibition era, was stationed during his brief but eventful service. He took part in a lot of raids and shootouts, and on March 21st he was in a gunfight with smugglers that left Prohibition agent Ernest W. Walker dead. In 1921, Hamer relocated to Austin and took on the position of Senior Ranger Captain. Hamer began leading the struggle in Texas against the Ku Klux Klan in 1922 while serving as senior captain of the Texas Rangers, which was still expanding in Texas. Throughout his career, Hamer prevented 15 people from being killed by lynch mobs. Hamer and a small group of Rangers were tasked with guarding the Sherman, Texas, courtroom during the trial of black rape suspect, George Hughes. Then, as a sizable mob drew near the courthouse, Hamer shot and injured 2 of the mob members himself. However, the courthouse was destroyed by the mob. Hamer and the Rangers were unable to reach Hughes before leaving the building. Hamer ended a murder-for-hire ring in 1928, and the extraordinary methods he used to do so made him a household name across the country. The Texas Bankers Association had started paying $5,000 for dead bank robbers, not a cent for live ones, as rewards. According to Hamer, men were setting up deadbeats and 2-bit criminals to be killed by complicit police officers, who would then collect the rewards and pay the men their finder's fees. After almost 27 years with the Rangers, Hamer retired in 1932. He left just 1 week before Miriam Ma Ferguson successfully reclaimed her position as governor for another term. At least 40 Rangers resigned rather than serve again under her when she was first elected, following the impeachment and forced resignation of her husband Pa Ferguson as governor. Early in the 1930s, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker's criminal activities garnered extensive media attention, embarrassing law enforcement and elected officials in a dozen states. In an Eastham Prison Farm raid on January 16, 1934, Barrow, Parker, and friend Jimmy Mullins broke out Raymond Hamilton, Henry Methvin, Hilton Bybee, and Joe Palmer. The Texas Department of Corrections received national negative publicity over the jailbreak. During the breakout, the escapees shot 2 guards, killing guard Major Crossan. On January 27,